hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody. Just so you all know, Dr. Pettis Perry will not be joining us today. Oops. We all need a laugh, right? It's good to laugh. Dr. Pettis Perry will not be joining us for today's program or the next one. He's off doing great things and needs the time to get them done. But he will be back for our October 23rd show about living a committed life with an upcoming interview guest, Lynn Twist. I, for one, will sure miss you, Pettis. Now, on with the show. Our program today is The United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America. Les Moonves, who was at the time the executive chairman and CEO of CBS, said, "Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." It's no secret that the goal of corporate-owned media is to increase the profit of the few, not to empower the many. As a result, people are increasingly immersed in an information system structured to reinforce their social biases and market to their buying preferences. Journalism's essential role has been drastically compromised, and Donald Trump's repeated claims of fake news and framing of the media as an enemy of the people have made a bad scenario worse. We have big things to do. Our bold guest today is Mickey Huff. Mickey is the director of Project Censored and president of the Media Freedom Foundation. Since 2009, he has co-edited the Project Censored yearbook, including its most recent volume, State of the Free Press 2022. He's also co-author with Nolan Higdon of the United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth World book. In 2019, he was recognized by the Society of Professional Journalists, Northern California chapter, for their annual James Madison Freedom of Information Beverly Keys Educator Award. He has co-authored essays on media and propaganda for several scholarly journals and news publications and helped script Project Censored's latest documentary on fake news and critical media literacy. Mickey is executive producer and host of The Project Censored Show, a weekly syndicated public affairs program he co-founded in 2010. His show originates from the historic studios of KPFA Pacifica Radio in Berkeley, California. Welcome to Be Bold America, Mickey.
Jill, it is an honor and a pleasure to be with you this Sunday afternoon. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's greatly appreciated.
Oh, I've just been so looking forward to speaking with you. And I'm sorry that your co-author, Nolan Higdon, couldn't join us, because doesn't he teach right up the hill from my studio at UC Santa Cruz?
He does.
Yeah.
He does. In fact, he teaches a whole class on fake news there that's based on his UC Press book, Anatomy of Fake News, and of course, the work that we've done with United States of Distraction, Let's Agree to Disagree. So maybe some students are tuning in and they know Dr. Higdon.
Yeah, I would sure like to, maybe I'll get to meet him sometime in the future. Well, I was so looking forward to speaking with you because you and Nolan wrote a brilliant book. It was published a couple years ago, but seems even more important today. Why did you and Nolan write this book, and how is Post-Truth America doing today?
Well, Jill. So this is it's a longer story, I guess, but
we have an hour.
Yes, we do. Thankfully, Nolan and I go back quite a ways. He was a student of mine some 15 odd years or longer ago, and that's one of those cases of watch what you wish for, right? Nolan, kept coming back around and. He teaches with us up at Diablo Valley College, and he teaches at UC Santa Cruz. And he and I just kept working together and doing things together. And he was working with us at Project Censored. And, we really just wanted to write a book that addressed the increasing nature of sort of our propaganda-addled society. We do this at Project Censored, but we do an annual book, and it has a formula, and Andy Lee Roth and I do the top stories, and we do media analysis and other things. I mean, the project's been around since 1976. So what we wanted to do with this book was we wanted to have a focus, and we wanted to look at how, as we become more and more a mediated society, and more that media is consolidated into the hands of a few corporate owners and big tech companies, we just started to look at the increasingly crass and commercial state of what passed for news media in the United States. We're talking about really an epidemic of infotainment, with emphasis on the tainment and distraction. And in the info part, it's more misinfo and disinfo. And so that's how this project really started. I mean, it was from our long time working together. But by the time we got past the 2016 election, we kind of jumped the shark somewhere. Things became even more propagandistic, more divisive, and almost cartoonishly so, where both the right and left in the United States rarely engage with one another. They make caricatures of each other, and then we kind of get siloed into our own little media worlds. And social media, anti-social media rather, has really pushed that in our media habits and behaviors. So what Nolan and I wanted to do in this book was say, hey, look, the problem here is that we had multiple warning signs for decades. I mean, if you want to be serious, it's over a century with what's been happening, going back to Hearst and Pulitzer, the Spanish-American War, the Creel Commission of World War I. And we're both historians as well, so this wasn't lost on us. And so we wanted to write a book that explained how we got here. And, of course, we had the great Ralph Nader, do a stellar foreword, because if anybody understands the neoliberal enclosure of the public commons, it's Ralph Nader, and the corporatist nature of the enclosure of the commons. And Nader really sets that up for us. And we start the prologue with a Lao Tzu quote: "If you do not change direction, you may end up where you are heading." And the main riff out of there, the main riff off of that is, well, are we there yet, Jill?
Yes, are we?
Because we've been heading here for a long time. And so as historians, as well as media scholars and journalists, we wanted to explain to people that this didn't just happen after the 2016 election. The Democrats were in such disbelief by the outcome. I don't think Democrats. I think a lot of people were in disbelief. Even Republicans, I think, were kind of surprised. In fact, I think Trump himself was surprised, as we've come to learn, that he was surprised that he won. And actually, he lost, right, by several million votes. But because of the way our system is, he ended up in the presidency. And I think it just kind of really sent a jolt into the entire system that this kind of celebrity apprentice star, this kind of bully character who's always been kind of on the cusp of the popular culture, somehow, I mean, even The Simpsons decades ago predicted a Donald Trump presidency as satire. But, what happens when art and reality kind of merge there?
Right.
We
Right.
found ourselves in a situation, with the media found itself, and yet the beautiful Les Moonves quote, who has since been Me Too'd and ousted at CBS. But, Moonves, it was a rare moment. He was at a tech conference in San Francisco when he said that Donald Trump may not be good for America, but he's damn good for CBS. I mean, this was just the mask ripped off. This was just saying out loud what people who've been following media bias and corporatization of media ownership, we've known this for years. But it's rare that these folks come out and just say the quiet part out loud. And that's what Moonves did. And the press kind of, I think in a lot of ways, the establishment press was kind of embarrassed. They kind of had this mea culpa moment where they said, my goodness, we didn't cover this seriously. We all kind of thought in our neoliberal bubbles that Clinton was a shoo-in as an establishment candidate. And my goodness, we turn around and look what's happened. And so the press from the beginning was pretty biased against Trump. And I think look, the press always has bias. But I think that backfired in a lot of ways because Trump is, among many things, he's kind of a con man and a grifter. He's a showman. He might not be your your type of showman. But he does have these carnival barker qualities that attract certain people's attention. And he was able to co-opt a lot of populist anger against the liberal establishment and use it to his favor. And much of his presidency, as you'll remember, Jill, was just catching things on fire. He would just go from one subject, one topic to another, barely dog whistling. I mean, if he's dog whistling racist epithets, it's through a bullhorn. He wasn't even concealing a lot of these kind of tawdry kind of qualities that we really don't like in a leader. And I think that the media tried to capitalize on that to take him down, but at every turn he was a step ahead of them. And he turned the media into a caricature of itself by essentially making them sort of at odds with him, and so he could get on equal footing. And he could get people to think that it was him against the media. And it really is a bad thing, because journalists should not be engaging with politicians in that regard. They should be following Society Professional Journalist Code of Ethics.
Oh, you mean Hannity shouldn't have been on the stage with Trump?
Oh my goodness! That's the absurdity of something like that.
Yes.
I mean, again, it's the mask coming off in public. It's like anybody who thought Fox News wasn't, a media adjunct of the Republican Party could no longer even pretend that wasn't the case. But in many cases, the liberal establishment press didn't really do a great job trying to go after the real problems with Trump. And, things like Russiagate and things where they doubled down over and over again, an impeachment that didn't really go anywhere. And it dragged out in terms of premediation for over a year and a half into 2 years. And the media was just constantly turning the page and saying, we're going to get him next time. Gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. And, here we are 2 years into the Biden presidency, and they're still playing that game with Trump. And so what Nolan and I were trying to point out in the book, and actually, Jill, when you said this earlier, I had to agree. This book seems more relevant now,
yes,
than when it came out. And we said that. We said, look, this book isn't about Trump. It's about media culture. It's it's happening to our political culture, and it's what's happening because of our completely corporate-controlled infotainment system. It's also coupled with a crumbling public education system, an educational system that's gone completely away from critical thinking, pedagogy, and only teaches to outcomes and tests. And when we throw all of this stuff together, right, and we shake it up, we basically get the United States of distraction. And media manipulation is a key part of what brought us here.
Wow. Well, I have a list of questions, but right now we'll take a break. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. Our topic today is the United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America. And we're speaking with Mickey Huff, co-author of that very book, director of Project Censored, president of Media Freedom Foundation, and producer and host of the Project Censored Show, a weekly syndicated public affairs program. To learn more, visit projectcensored.com. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Likely to hear on most media outlets. Please join me on KSQD Santa Cruz, your ink spot on the dial for the Thom Hartmann program. Heard now for the first time ever in the Monterey Bay area at 90.7 FM. Weekdays at 4 p.m. That's Progressive Talking Conversation with me, Thom Hartmann. Weekdays at 4 p.m. on KSQD 90.7 FM. Tag you're it.
Now, tag you're it, Mickey. We're back and we're speaking with our bold guest, Mickey Huff. Mickey, Thomas Jefferson once famously said that if he was given the ultimatum of choosing to live in a functioning nation without newspapers or a place with newspapers but no national government, he'd surely choose the latter. Can a nation survive as a democratic republic without an honest and trusted news ecosystem? You were talking about the ecosystem before. Can American democracy survive the fake news crisis?
Well, that's a great question, Jill. And, the short answer to that is no.
I was afraid of that.
Yeah, I mean, but there are, of course, degrees, right? There's degrees
right.
to the challenges we face. And, of course, there are things we can do about it. And we'll get to that later in the program, I'm sure. But the notion that we can be self-governing is predicated on the fact that we're reasonable. We have access to accurate information. We may have different perspectives, and we may come from different places. But there are things called facts, right? Mark Twain quipped at one point, get your facts first, then you can distort them as much as you please. And we certainly live in the latter half of that one, right? But we've kind of moved on in a lot of ways since 9/11. In fact, I remember after the events of 9/11 talking about us moving into a post-fact world. Mm-hmm. Now, later, of course, Oxford Dictionary makes post-truth word of the year in 2016 after the U.S. election, essentially saying that people are mostly guided by their emotions and their beliefs, and they'll bend the facts if they have to meet their confirmation bias, right? And so what we see here is really an epistemic crisis. What we see in the United States of Distraction book, the City Lights book from a couple years ago, Nolan and I laid out what we thought were 4 major contributors to this. And so really quickly, I just wanted to talk about the crumbling.
You're going right into one of my questions. Go right ahead.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No. Go ahead.
The crumbling fourth estate, right? Our democracy has been more and more privatized. There's been a corporate enclosure of the commons, as I mentioned before. We actually talk about that history, going back to James Buchanan, the Lewis Powell memo in the Nixon years, Grover Norquist. I mean, there's a documented history of this, right? And so we wanted people to remember that if you were paying attention, and if this was the kind of history that you tended to learn in school, but it isn't, then you would not be surprised by the things that were happening, and we could speak a common language of historical facts. However, because of these 4 major public vulnerabilities, we don't have common factual ground. So the first of these is a pervasive commercial entertainment culture. In the last 50 years, we've seen a massive push towards commercial ownership of media, increase of infotainment. It's not just if it bleeds, it leads, but the more sensationalized nature of what turns into news these days. We've also, the second of these, we've become increasingly hyper-partisanship. Even in the throes of the Cold War, Jill, there were certain things that Americans could agree upon. Facts mattered. I'm not saying there's a golden age here. Please don't misinterpret me. There were plenty of problems.
There's no such thing as a perfect system, but we can keep trying for it.
Not at all. No. And so, but, like nowadays, like the major public opinion polls about what troubles us most, the number one fear of Americans today is other Americans. And so this is an extraordinary development, and it's coupled with the hyper-partisanship that, I'm right, you're wrong, no matter what. There's no more reaching across the aisle. There's no more real bipartisan efforts. It's kind of a cutthroat world, like world wrestling, right, as Matt Taibbi wrote in Hate Incorporated. The whole wrestling metaphor is basically, unfortunately fitting for our political culture. The third of our public vulnerabilities is we have an extraordinarily fragmented media landscape. Even so-called public media isn't really public. It's mostly funded by corporate interests. And you've got a handful from big pharma, big ag, fossil fuels, big tech, the military-industrial surveillance complex. They've all got their fingers into the pie. And social media has completely fractured any kind of social cohesion or fabric. It's really exploited our confirmation biases and our fears of each other. So the fragmented media landscape and the siloed media platforms that we have really work to keep us apart rather than help us work together. And the final on this, Jill, is a repetition from before. It's our ineffective educational system. And I'd like to rephrase it, that I don't believe that it's ineffective. That pretends that it's designed to create independent thinking people. It is not. It has completely been transformed from the days of John Dewey and others. And it's been transformed into more of a system of indoctrination or career training, taking of tests, memorization and regurgitation of information rather than real-life problem-solving skills. Other things we don't teach very well include cultural competency. We don't value the humanities and the liberal arts and the lessons of that. That's not in the STEM categories, right? And so we don't have time to waste on that. But, Jill, what do we learn? And by the way, thank you for your great service in information science and working with libraries. Librarians are heroic figures.
Well, I was going to mention that. I did facilitate 2 international meetings, one in Prague and one in Egypt, on information literacy, and learned quite a lot. But there was the information literacy meeting of experts that developed the Prague Declaration, and then there was also the high-level colloquium on information literacy and lifelong learning in Alexandria, Egypt. And so I have been interested in this topic since 2003, 2005. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Well, no, you didn't interrupt at all. I wanted to point that out. This isn't a one-way talk. We're supposed to be conversing. So I have to let you get a word in edgewise on your own show.
What a concept!
But there's so much to say.
Yes, I know.
This is the end of Banned Books Week. This is the end of Banned Books Week, by the way, the 40th anniversary.
Yes.
And what are we celebrating? The right to read, the right to learn, the right to think, the right to explore. And that is something that is, I think, essential in education. And we've really kind of gone off the rails there. And these are the ending of the 4 public vulnerabilities that Higdon and I explore in the United States of Distraction. And we think that with these combinations over the last 50, 60, even 70 years, going back towards the end of World War II, when things could have taken a different turn, we instead have gone this path. And so if you go back and historically trace the signposts and the warnings, you'll see that it's not really surprising that we are in the state that we're currently in, because we've really worked kind of hard to get here.
You also talk about in your book about the Society of Professional Journalists 4 Code of Ethics, but I think there's a sentence there too that said the business of commercial media is to attract, harvest, and sell people's consciousness to advertisers. So we've got, what are those 4 Code of Ethics? And it seems that they're not working.
Well, I'm afraid that it seems like what passes for quote unquote journalism these days is a sorry state of affairs. And what's interesting is that we have a lot of focus on opinion or perspective, but we don't really have focus on, again, I'm going to repeat myself, but we don't have a focus on facts. And I think the American public is right to find themselves distrusting establishment and corporate media. There's nothing mainstream about 6 companies owning 90% of this. And I think that people are looking for news. They're looking to go for information, but they don't know where to find it. And this is why we teach critical media literacy, is because we don't think there's a place you can go. There's not like a truth.com. We have to teach people how to read critically, how to deconstruct information, how to ask the right questions. And as a journalist, the Society of Professional Journalists have a code of ethics. You can go to spj.org, and you can see the first thing is seek truth and report it. So that's number 1. The second is minimize harm, right? When you're reporting, think about what you're saying and how you're saying it, and how are different groups or different demographics of people impacted by what you're doing or what you're saying. Third, and very important, act independently. Journalists can't act independent if they're working for a corporate team, because they're beholden to shareholders at the end of the day. And so acting independently is something that's very difficult to do in a private corporate media setting. And the final is be accountable and transparent, right? And so if we follow these 4 guidelines, and in fact, some of your listeners may be privy to chambers of commerce or the Rotary clubs and things in communities. The Rotary Club has 4 codes of ethics too. And you know what? They overlap almost exactly. And it's very interesting, because when we talk about, corporate corruption and corporate impact on society, what we're talking about is corrupt business, we're not necessarily talking about ethical business practices. We're talking about unfair settings. We're talking about collusion. I know conspiracy is a word that's been completely trashed over the decades. But as Lewis Powell wrote in his memo in the early 1970s, before he became a Supreme Court judge, talking to his neighbor, who was on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, he said, we've got a plan. The right-wing business community needs to plan against this public assault, right? Because they saw the university movement, the free speech movement, the civil rights movement, the movement for equality of gays and lesbians. They saw that as an affront to their definition of American exceptionalism. And they started their own think tanks as their quote, colleges. They started their own media outlets. And, they really galvanized in many ways up through the Reagan administration when it really kind of came together, right, for the right wing in this country. And the Democrats have never been able to really regroup from that other than by moving to the middle or to the right. And that's what the Clintons represented, and that's what we refer to as neoliberalism. And Nolan and I spend time in the book talking about not just how the right-wing corporate agenda and the enclosure of the commons has impacted us, but how the Democrats' lack of effectiveness in resisting that takeover and going along with it has actually doomed us to where we now are.
Yes, those who are regular listeners will know the word neoliberalism because we just had Tom Hartman on our last show talking about the hidden history of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And we are here today without having had any other pushback. Now, Mickey, are you familiar with Rick Scott's 11-point plan to rescue America? Is there any effect on the media that this is going to have?
Well, I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head, so I'd have to look up and see what exactly the plan is. I see 11-point plan to rescue America, Rick Scott, a Republican senator in Florida. I see.
Well, what happened is Mitch McConnell wouldn't tell people that he was asked if you take over the House and Senate in the midterms, what are your plans? What are your policies? And he refused to say. And he said, I think, actually, I'll tell you after the election. And then Rick Scott came up with this 11-point plan to rescue America that is just, a right-wing fever dream. And
the language looks incredibly Orwellian, however.
Yes,
I'm seeing here that Scott is co-opting much of the language from woke identity politics and kind of turning it on its head.
Yes.
Which I think is why the left should never have sunk all of its eggs into the identity politic basket. That's probably something bold to say for your show and probably not popular. It's probably not popular to say, but I'm not saying that we shouldn't be interested in racial politics and understanding what it means to be woke per se. But this has been completely co-opted by the corporate right. It's completely taken the university and the college system by storm. And one of the things that it's done is that it's given this language as a weapon to be turned around. It's much like how the Democrats were crying fake news with Russia, and Trump took it off leash and said, oh, yeah, you think I'm fake news? You're fake news. And he turned it into an attack against the media like Nixon and Agnew did, calling the press the enemy of the people. And this is exactly what's happening now. This is why people in Florida like DeSantis are getting so much support by the right, is because they see him sticking it to the lips. They see him flipping it around and flipping the script on them. And I tell you, the one thing that I think that the left is missing, which is ironic, is they seem to have abandoned class analysis. And you don't have to take my word for it. African-American economists like Adolph Reed Jr. have been screaming this from the rafters, that if the Democrats and the left want to get inroads, they're going to have to build class solidarity. They're going to have to not only prioritize racial politics, but they're going to have to go back to class, and they're going to have to go back to what it means to live in diverse communities economically, right? Not just on these other issues that are easy. These are all hot-button culture issues. It's so easy to divide people on race or sex or any of these types of things.
The other. Yeah, it's always the other.
The other, right. Yeah. But the one thing that the other doesn't work with is if you're in the lower classes, it doesn't matter if you like X, Y, or Z. That doesn't change your lot in life, and it doesn't better your living conditions.
Well, I've always had an issue with the Democrats not messaging. I keep saying, "Where's our Frank Luntz?" I know
well, George Lakoff tried.
He tried. His little blue handbook was wonderful.
Yeah.
You're listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the ksqd.org website. If you're just joining us, our topic is The United States of Distraction, and we're speaking with Mickey Huff, co-author of that book and director of Project Censored. Would you like to be added to our news group and get advance notice of upcoming interviews? If so, please text Be Bold America at 22828. Text Be Bold America at 22828. And if you have signed up already, we thank you. We will be back with our bold guest, Mickey Huff, right after the Hightower commentary, where Jim tells us the Oracle speaks. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Mega investor Warren Buffett once held a big portfolio of daily and weekly newspapers, and he specialized in squeezing out competitors so each held a local monopoly. Then he'd chop staff and news content, letting him glean annual profit margins above 30%. But alas for poor Warren, along came the internet, allowing people to root around for free to find local information missing from his hollowed-out papers. They began losing readers, advertising, and profits, so in 2020, Buffett sold out his entire portfolio. But rather than concede that maybe his slash-and-burn profit maximization approach had produced inferior products, the Oracle of Omaha, as Wall Street had labeled him, blasted the whole idea of local newspapers as dinosaurs. They're toast, he proclaimed. But wait, your oracleness. When done right, local publications both chronicle and help shape a community story. And that's a social benefit that's as valuable and as marketable as ever. It's not that people have given up on local news, but that corporate-owned papers did. They're not local, not newsy, and not of, by and far, the workaday people in our communities. For example, nearly every corporate daily publishes a business section, which mostly amounts to yesterday's stock prices, corporate press releases, and syndicated filler. Does even 1% of the population read that stuff? Meanwhile, how about economic news of interest to the great majority of locals who are workaday families? Where's the regular section that digs into the wages, workplace conditions, and other real-life issues that confront this majority on a daily basis? This is Jim Hightower saying the relevant indicator of the well-being of nearly every American family is not the Dow Jones average, but the Doug Jones average. How are Doug and Donna doing? That's news that would sell papers. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, live streamed from the Chat and Chew Cafe. Details at hightowerlowdown.org.
Welcome back. Our topic is the United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America. And we're speaking with our bold guest, Mickey Huff. Now, Mickey, listening to the Hightower commentary, I wanted to tell you a little bit of research that I did here for our local papers and then get some thoughts from you. It just happened that this month's Hightower, it says Jim Hightower's Hightower Lowdown newsletter, September 2022, he wrote in that, our papers are getting worse at a time we desperately need them to get better. They are no longer mediums of journalism, civic purpose, and local identity. Rather, they've been reduced to a little more than profit savings, steadily piping local money to the handful of distant high-finance syndicates that have bought out our hometown journals. And we have two papers here, the Santa Cruz Sentinel and the Monterey Herald. And I was doing some research and found that back in 2013 and 2014, they became owned by Digital First Media, which is now the second largest publisher in the United States. And one source said they were headquartered in New York, and another said they were headquartered in Denver, Colorado. But in either case, it's piping our local monies off to other locations. And that this media conglomerate, the Digital First Media, reaches 67 million Americans each month on more than 800 multi-platform products across 18 states. Our two newspapers now share a common publisher, advertising director, and circulation director. And Bill Singleton, who co-founded Media News, the Media News Group, but eventually turned into Digital Media, First Media, with another company, he pioneered clustering. So I thought maybe you could talk about local news industry and what clustering is. And are our local newspapers toast?
Well, that was a very, very timely Hightower lowdown.
Yes.
Topically for the show today. I felt like we were just going to chime in and start talking with him. Because what you're talking about and what he's describing is something that media scholars have been decrying for years now as the trend has continued, and that is the creation of local news deserts. And this is the result of small local papers, Jim already said this, closing down or being bought out by major corporate interests. In fact, one of the fastest growing groups of in the economy that, quote, own the media are actually venture capitalists and hedge funds. So very odd that these are just now brazenly, these media outlets are being turned into just cash cows for corporate media and commercial propaganda. They're downsizing newsrooms, getting rid of local reporters. They don't cover what happens at the city hall. They don't cover what's going on with school boards. They don't have local voices from people in the community the way that they once did. And another bland, stale, prepackaged kind of news goes out. And like Hightower was saying, there's a business section. There's no labor section, right? And then, of course, there's the weather and sports. The weather is somehow always reporting about what's happening without ever addressing the climate crisis. Sports is completely commercially and corporately owned for profit. So at every place you look in these news outlets, there's less and less news you can use. And so before that there was, you were just mentioning, in radio, you had Clear Channel. And what Clear Channel did is they were going up and buying up over 1,000 stations all over the U.S. And that's basically when, people were turning away, and FM was the commercial part, and people were watching cable news and other things. And so a lot of people, particularly liberals, didn't think about AM radio as being any kind of a real market, and it was taken over by the right wing. I mean, Rush Limbaugh, of course, was one of the big names and big people that grew that. But you mentioned Hannity before and a bunch of other copycat people that have come out. And these stations, over 1,000 stations, they had right-wing commentary and radio masquerading as news 12 hours a day. And so that's where you see people listening to this propaganda over and over and over again. And then when you go and if you find out, hear any other kind of information from anywhere else, your inclination is to disbelieve it. I didn't hear that. It wasn't on, quote, the news, right? And then rather than analyze and see, well, what exactly is happening to the news, it's turning into nothing but opinion. It's turning into, one-sided affairs. It's turning into only attack and gotcha politics. And then over a period of a couple decades, people wonder, what happened? Well, back to Lao Tzu. If you're not careful, you're going to end up where you're heading. And we've been heading here for a long time. And I think the Trump presidency was, in fact, a direct result of that kind of calamity. And there are efforts afoot now to counter that. There are many efforts. There's a couple great things. So the group Free Press, freepress.net, Craig Aaron, journalists like journalism professors, comms professors and scholars like Victor Pickard, Democracy Without Journalism, a brilliant book. He's at UPenn Annenberg. They have ways in which they're trying to get funding through the public sector to purposely grow grassroots public interest journalism at the local level. They have a couple pilot programs in New Jersey. They're trying it at a few other places. But they're trying to rebuild an actual public media system. PBS coming out of the 60s, was kind of a sort of a dream for that. But it got more and more corporate. It got more and more away from its mission. And we don't really have, Jill, a real strong public and community media program in the United States. some communities, maybe like Santa Cruz, maybe like Berkeley, have outlets that don't exist in most other American cities. But we need to use these as models, right? And we need to have a strong public infrastructure of support where you don't have to go on the air every 2 weeks to beg for money, right? It's the same kind of thing that the right did to schools. They're strangling them. And by making media the enemy of the people, they can rightfully then strangle and cut off that kind of funding. And then, look, we haven't even gotten into the impact of big tech on all of this because it's been profound. Big tech in Silicon Valley has been a massive influence on what's happened to the decline of news culture and creating a clickbait confirmation bias society. And, that's a topic all of its own, actually. And then all the surveillance and censorship that goes on with Silicon Valley technology. That's a major challenge that really only a unified, well-informed public can stand up to and then resist in any meaningful way.
Well, what do you say to people? Because I hear this all the time. Oh, both sides are the same, to blame, between MSNBC and the so-called Fox News. Everybody's lying. Is that true?
It's true to a certain extent, but let's not be coy. Nolan and I talk about this in the book. And in fact, we got some flack for it, even from our own publisher, who was saying, hey, you're being kind of hard on Rachel Maddow. She's a PhD in political science. And I said, that's great. I said, some of the greatest propagandists have PhDs in political science. That doesn't make them automatically a good journalist. And so when we went out, in fact, by the way, in several court cases and other things came out, it was actually determined that Maddow isn't technically a journalist. Hannity has, in fact, admitted that he isn't one. Like, he's just publicly admitted it. And as you mentioned earlier on stage campaigning with Trump, we know that. But we think that it's important that if you're going to be a critical media literate person, it's important that you critique the content you see from no matter where it comes and dissect it accordingly. And that's not to say that Maddow is Hannity. That's not necessarily true at all.
That would be a false equivalency.
That is right. But what is true is that Maddow made a cottage industry out of a distraction for years, and that was the constant flogging of Russiagate to try to bring down Donald Trump at the expense of many, many stories. What kind of stories? Take a look at ProjectCensor.org and see the top 25 stories for the last 5 years, and you'll see scores of stories that weren't about Russia collusion. They were about real things happening in our community, both good and bad, that these major media platforms weren't interested in because they weren't sexy, they didn't draw eyeballs, they didn't make a lot of money, and it wasn't about gotcha politics. And for that, Maddow is also guilty. Now, again, I realize the false equivalency that she is nowhere near what we see in a Pirro or a Hannity.
Well, I think to make your point a bit is that on MSNBC, they're never going to have a story on internet neutrality because their parent company. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it is equal to Fox News when, as you probably know, Roger Ailes said that I have a quote here. We have no obligation to tell the viewer anything not to our advantage. And he also said that the viewer must feel welcome and safe and separate from people not like them. So it was meant, and it was meant to be a propaganda tool because he did that 16-point strategy paper for Nixon in 1968 that basically said how you can use television as a Republican propaganda tool. And then he was able to find Rupert Murdoch and do it.
John Kennedy warned of that in 1958 when he was running for Senate. He, in fact, warned that whomever would master the medium of television could be an incredible manipulator, that they could be incredibly adept at swaying public opinion. And, hey, Kennedy learned that himself when he edged out Nixon in the debate because people that saw him on television, Kennedy was savvy to the new media. Nixon wasn't, right? And so the media is the message, as Marshall McLuhan later said. And so I think it's important that we remember not just what you said about Murdoch and Ailes, but we also have to remember the people that were at MSNBC that were busy firing Phil Donahue and Jeff Cohen because he wanted to do voices against the Iraq invasion, and they made him do 2 or 3 people that were pro-war for every anti-war, and they eventually fired him because he would not support an only pro-war agenda on his program, which was the top-rated program at the time on MSNBC.
I'm so glad you mentioned Jeff Cohen, because he was a guest on our program a couple of years ago. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Mickey Huff, co-author of The United States of Distraction, director of Project Censored, president of the Media Freedom Foundation, and producer and host of the Project Censored Show, a weekly syndicated public affairs program. Visit projectcensored.com for more information. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Try to see it my way.
What to Be features college students interviewing creative, surprising, passionate people about their careers. If you have ever wondered what to be, please join us Sundays, 7 p.m., K-Squid, 90.7 FM.
Say goodnight. We can work it out. We can work it out. Life.
You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Want a friend to hear this interview? Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you and your friends may listen from your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple, Google, Spotify, Radio Public, and many more. Subscribe for free. Now, Mickey, I have a couple more questions, and then I want to get into the subtitle of your book on media manipulation, which was What We Can Do About It. But I do have a couple questions. One is, what is currently happening at CNN?
Well, it looks like they're getting a total makeover. Their ratings have been in the toilet. They've been shown to be an ineffectual propaganda organ for the Democratic Party. They've suffered extraordinary setbacks from a lack of journalistic ethics over the last couple of years. Their CNN Plus was an unmitigated disaster and an embarrassment. And what we're seeing is a shakeup over there that looks like they may even be changing somewhat ideological direction. So I think what's happening in CNN is kind of an object lesson in what's wrong with cable news. And I know Fox News kind of, we can hold Fox News up and say, well, this is a total train wreck. But that train wreck always has people looking at it. And they can guarantee 3-4 million eyeballs watching that train wreck of Tucker Carlson on almost any given night.
It's a professional gaslighting organization.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's no question about it. But CNN, you can't outfox Fox.
That's true.
And CNN has tried, and they have failed miserably. I think if CNN was going to do anything that would counter Fox, it would be try to actually practice ethical journalism in the public interest. And that might garner them a serious boost in viewers, particularly if they wouldn't so obsequiously be sucking up to the DNC and the neoliberal corporate core of the Democratic Party, right? That's just as off-putting to people as people on the left find Fox. And so the antidote to that isn't to just offer another perspective and double down. It's how about you get back to the roots of investigative journalism? How about if you really find your best reporting and model that and have your shows like that? Instead of it being 3 talking heads throwing chairs at each other or 4 people with one opinion and another person with a different one getting beaten up on, why don't you spend your time doing long investigative reports that actually educate the public and earn their respect?
Yes.
CNN hasn't earned it, and that's why it's not there.
Now, do you think, I've been thinking about this question for a while, and I've been wanting to ask you, do you think the First Amendment that we value so highly might actually be the amendment that ends democracy because we don't know how to stop fake news and propaganda because of it?
Well, that's funny. The follow-up to United States of Distraction, Nolan and I wrote is Let's Agree to Disagree, a critical thinking guide to communication, conflict management, and critical media literacy that's basically modeled after the final chapter of USOD. And the final chapter of United States of Distraction is the And What You Can Do About It section, where instead of having, us go over the problems and the calamities for 200 pages and then have 3 paragraphs on, but there's hope and we can do more. No, we wanted to have a long, in fact, it's one of the longest chapters in the book that detailed what you can do.
And
we got so much feedback when we did that talks around the country people, we jokingly call that Make America Think Again.
Yes,
right?
that's what we do in this last quarter hour is what listeners can keep doing, stop doing, and start doing. And so that chapter is just ripe with all ideas about that. But what overwhelms me is that so many people in organizations such as yours, and way back to my days working on information literacy, and yet that armored bubble still exists that you were talking about earlier about, the facts, we can't agree on the facts, and that bubble still exists. America is in a crisis right now, caused in large part by dishonest actors across the right-wing spectrum of our media and social media. I wanted to get your thoughts on, how you handle that being overwhelmed as well, and then go into keep, stop, start.
So there is the problem that you just described coming particularly from the right, from the corporate sector, the business sector, the ownership of media sector, the advertising model. But let's also not forget that it's coming from the neoliberal technocratic side of Silicon Valley with so-called fact checkers and news guard. That's basically a who's who of national security state people, military spooks, and the rest. So when you have a society where you don't trust one end and you don't trust the people that are coming in to fact check because you can blatantly see their own biases, you are creating a truth emergency effectively. You're creating a climate where no one trusts anything, and it's really nihilistic. And so how do you counter that? What do you do? Well, we try to go back to some of the basic things around the First Amendment. The First Amendment covers what government shouldn't be doing, right?
Right.
But it doesn't say that corporations can't do it.
Exactly.
And so that's the kind of what we have this major dilemma because we have a ripe culture where we see censorship by proxy, whether it's from big tech or so-called fact checkers or corporate-owned media. The First Amendment doesn't really apply all that much to the chicanery that's afoot there, which is why we think the antidote to this problem, this challenge, is to teach critical media literacy. And that means you're teaching people what's the power structure behind the media, who is controlling it, to what end, how does it operate, why is it that certain voices are heard and others are not. And when people begin to understand that, they increasingly become more and more in control of their opinions, and they know where to turn to find different sources of information. So we said that here's some fixes. Number one, you can broaden your news frame. You can get more and more information from a broad source of independent sources. We have a long list of independent sources at projectcensored.org.
So start broadening your news consumption.
Yeah, start broadening it. And look, if you're going to stop something, stop only consuming corporate media. I mean, I would say turn it off. But as a scholar of media, I watch corporate media because I want to know what the establishment propaganda is. I want to know why the person next to me just seems to be impervious to facts. And if I watched Fox the night before, I can probably tell why. Right? It's because they're just not getting the full story. This is also related to the thing we talked about earlier, Jill, and that's we need more local investigative journalism so people feel more connected to their own communities. We have these news deserts that is creating this vacuum where people are hungry for knowledge and information. They don't always know where to get it. This comes into the third fix, educational media. News media can and should be educational. When I have my students research independent news stories for Validated Independent News with Project Censored, and they put together these news summaries, and they do reports on this, and they do kind of presentations. Many times my students will give a 15-minute presentation that's more factual and more informative than a whole hour of broadcast news on any given night.
Wow.
So it's possible.
That's terrific.
It's possible. It's just you have to teach people what it looks like. We also think we need to have better support for whistleblowers and truth tellers, and we need to be very acutely aware that we are in an information war, and the best person to trust is yourself if you are critically media literate. Censorship and blacklisting is not the solution to our current problem and our current crisis. Becoming an independent, critical thinker is. And that's what we call for in the book. And we say that through civics education, critical pedagogy, critical awareness in media, community engagement, and cultural competency, we can collectively work to rebuild a people's media ecosystem.
Oh, wow. Well, one thing I also like the phrase I heard somewhere, I don't know where, is that be a factivist. And I looked it up, and it's in the Urban Dictionary as an activist campaigning to bring about a social and political change based largely upon factual evidence. So
Well,
it's
sign me
being a
up.
factivist as well.
Sign me up, Jill.
Okay. Well, one thing I also wanted to mention was under the Keep, Stop, Start, is people should start signing up for Project Censored's newsletter. And I also think that you've got another publication coming out called The Media and Me is on October 25th. Is that?
Yeah.
I just have 30 seconds. So
I think it's delayed, but that's a great collective book, 10 authors. Media and Me is a critical media literacy book for young people targeting 13 to 18 years old. You can learn more at projectcensored.org or censoredpress.org.
Well, we just had the Monterey County Superintendent of Schools on the program, so I was going to send that Media and Me notification to her. All right,
Please
Mickey,
do.
I will. I'm so grateful that you could join us on Be Bold America. Thank you for all you do. You and your organizations are doing vital work to save our democracy, and our future depends on it. Thank you, Mickey, for being our bold and impressive guest today.
And thank you for being a brave and bold host all the time.
Thank you. What's next on Be Bold America? On October 9th, 5 p.m., we will be speaking with Dr. Bryant Welch. Dr. Welch is a clinical psychologist and attorney who's been observing the American mind as it has played out in the political arena for over 2 decades. In his book, State of Confusion, Political Manipulation and the Assault on the American Mind, Dr. Welch predicted that the assault from the right would destabilize the ability of citizens to discern right from wrong, honest from dishonest, pushing our democracy into a slide towards dictatorship. Join us for State of Confusion on Be Bold America, October 9th at 5 p.m. You'll also hear Dr. Welch's insights and solutions that are needed to bring clarity and stability to the psychological crisis faced by all Americans. Remember, Be Bold America is available as a podcast. Now you may listen to the show anytime for free from your favorite podcast platform. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's program engineer, Eliza James, and the station's program director, Howard Feldstein. You're listening to KSQD Santa Cruz, many voices, one station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for Lori Katz with Cats on Dog, and filling in for her is Jill Kessler Miller. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.